Deep within the industrial heart of the city, where the hum of high-voltage fences cut through the smog and cold rain slicked the concrete walls of a brutalist estate, Silas Vane had built a life on the foundation of absolute silence. He was a man who moved through the shadows of the underworld without leaving a footprint, expecting neither mercy nor company. But at 3 a.m. on this rain-drenched night, a rhythmic, metallic clicking triggered the perimeter sensors at his iron gates. When the heavy monitors flickered to life, the image on the screen changed his world forever. The Iron Bastion stood as a jagged monument of concrete and steel, a fortress designed to keep the world at a safe, distant reach. Towering walls topped with razor wire enclosed the perimeter, guarded by motion-tracking cameras and a silence that felt heavier than the storm. This was not merely a residence, it was the lair of Silas Vane, the man the syndicates called the Vault, for a heart that no one could pick and a resolve that never leaked. Silas was a figure of unyielding discipline, his presence commanding a room before he ever uttered a word. He stood with a predatory stillness, his frame hardened by years of surviving the city's most dangerous corners. Across his sharp features, a prominent scar ran like a jagged lightning bolt, a physical testament to a failure from a decade ago that he had vowed would be his last. He was a man who lived in a monochrome world of dark coats and steel-gray intentions, moving with an authority that required no volume. Tonight, as the wind howled against the reinforced glass and the city glowed a dull orange in the distance, he sat in his darkened study, a ghost in his own machine, until the monitors revealed a massive white beast emerging from the fog. The saga of Silas Vane, a man who built a fortress to keep the world out, is a powerful reminder that no soul is beyond the reach of grace. If you believe that even the most hardened heart can find its reason to beat again, share this story with someone who needs a glimmer of hope today. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and subscribe to Devout Mafia Tales for more cinematic journeys of faith, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds of love. Now, let us return to the Iron Bastion, where the silence of the vault is about to be broken. The Iron Bastion lived up to its name, a hollow monolith where sound came to die. Inside, Silas Vane moved with a precision that bordered on the mechanical. His morning ritual was a symphony of silence, the soft hiss of the espresso machine, the muffled thud of his boots on polished concrete, and the rhythmic strike of his knuckles against a heavy punching bag in the gym. Every movement was calculated, every breath measured. In the underworld, noise was a leak, and a leak was a death sentence. Silas had spent the last decade plugging every hole in his life until nothing remained but the cold, hard shell of the vault. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his training room, watching the gray dawn struggle to break through the industrial smog. His reflection stared back, a man of shadows. He traced the jagged line of the scar on his face with a calloused thumb. It was a raised, angry mark that served as a permanent map of his greatest sin. 10 years ago, he hadn't been a vault. He had been a guardian for a woman whose name he still couldn't say aloud without feeling a phantom ache in his chest. He had allowed himself the luxury of a lapse, a single second of distraction, a moment where he looked at her smile instead of the doorway. In that heartbeat, the world had shattered. The screech of tires, the flash of a blade, and the warm, terrifying weight of blood on his hands. He had survived the ambush, but the person he was supposed to protect had not. The scar was the price of that second. It was a reminder that for a man in his position, emotion was a structural flaw. Since then, Silas had retreated into this brutalist sanctuary. He took only the most high-stakes contracts, jobs that required a ghost rather than a man. He spoke only when necessary, often going weeks without hearing the sound of his own voice. He had curated his surroundings to be as unyielding as his resolve. There were no soft fabrics in the Iron Bastion, no photographs on the walls, and certainly no warmth. He found a grim comfort in the sterility of it all. If there was nothing to love, there was nothing to lose. His enforcer's life was a series of variables he could control. He knew the weight of every weapon in his armory. He knew the exact timing of the perimeter patrols. He knew how to disappear into the architecture of the city until he was nothing more than a rumor whispered by terrified men in backrooms. He had convinced himself that this was the apex of power, to be untouchable because he was unreachable. But as he stood in the dim light of his study, surrounded by the expensive, hollow luxuries of a man with too much money and no one to spend it on, the silence felt heavier than usual. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a man at rest, it was the pressurized silence of a tomb. He checked the security feed, the blue light of the monitors washing over his scarred features. The world outside was cold and indifferent, just the way he liked it. Or so he told himself. He didn't realize that the walls he had built to keep the pain out had simply trapped the ghost of his failure inside with him. He was the king of a concrete kingdom, waiting for a storm he didn't know was coming. The stillness of the iron bastion was shattered not by a scream, but by the persistent, rhythmic chime of the perimeter alarm. Silas didn't rush, haste was for the desperate. He moved to the bank of monitors, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the infrared feeds. At the primary gate, silhouetted against the driving rain, stood a figure that seemed to have been conjured from the storm itself. It was massive, draped in a coat of startling, ghost-white fur that shimmered under the halogen security lights. Silas grabbed a heavy coat and a handgun, the cold weight of the weapon a familiar comfort. He stepped out into the night, the deluge instantly soaking through his clothes. As he approached the iron bars, the sheer scale of the creature became clear. It was a great Pyrenees, a mountain of a dog with eyes that held a haunting, human-like intelligence. She didn't growl. She didn't bark. She simply stood there, her body positioned protectively in front of a sleek, black stroller that looked entirely out of place in Silas's world of jagged edges and concrete. "Move," Silas commanded, his voice a low rasp that usually made men tremble. The dog didn't flinch. She leaned her weight against the stroller's handle, nudging it forward an inch through the bars. It was a calculated gesture, an offering. Silas felt a prickle of unease. He reached out, his hand hovering over the gate's manual override, before finally pulling the heavy iron open just enough to step through. The Great Pyrenees, whom he would later know as Juno, sat back on her haunches, her gaze fixed on him with a quiet, primordial dignity. Silas ignored the animal and looked down into the stroller. Sheltered beneath a waterproof canopy was a bundle of soft, cream-colored wool. As he peeled back the edge of the blanket, a pair of wide, curious eyes met his. The infant didn't cry, she simply reached out a tiny, translucent hand, her fingers brushing against the rough wool of his sleeve. Tucked into the folds of the blanket was a small, cream-colored envelope, sealed with a wax stamp he recognized instantly, the crest of a woman he had once sworn to protect, a ghost from the life that had cost him his soul. With trembling fingers, Silas opened the note. The handwriting was frantic, stained by what looked like dried droplets of blood. "Silas," the note began, the ink blurring under the falling rain. "They are coming for her. Malachi will not stop until the ledger is found. You are the only sanctuary left in a city of traitors. Please, keep Lyra safe. To the only man who never breaks." The words hit Silas with the force of a physical blow. He looked from the letter to the child, then to the massive white dog watching him with expectant patience. The vault had been breached, not by a hit squad or an explosive, but by a silent plea and a fragile light. For the first time in 10 years, the absolute discipline of his life felt like a cage. He looked at the baby, Lyra, and then back at the dark, empty road behind them. He knew that by taking this stroller, he was inviting a war into his fortress. But as the dog let out a soft, low whine and nudged his hand, Silas realized the choice had already been made. He reached down, gripped the handle of the stroller, and began to pull the white ghost and the child into the shadows of the bastion. The steel gates hissed shut, sealing the iron bastion once more, but the silence inside now felt fractured. Silas maneuvered the stroller through the minimalist foyer, the wheels clicking rhythmically against the slate floor. Behind him, Juno followed like a silent, white tide. Her paws made no sound, yet her presence was a heavy, watchful weight that Silas could feel pressing against his spine. When he reached the center of the expansive living area, Silas stopped and turned. "You've done your job," he said, his voice flat and final. "The child is inside. Now, go." The Great Pyrenees didn't move. She sat back on her haunches, her head level with the stroller's handle, her dark eyes fixed on Silas with an expression of ancient, unshakable resolve. She was a guardian who recognized no authority but the one she had chosen, and she had clearly chosen to stay. Silas stepped toward her, intending to lead her to the service entrance, but Juno let out a vibration, not a growl, but a low, resonant hum of warning that vibrated in Silas's own chest. It was a clear message: where the child went, the shadow followed. Frustration flared in Silas's gut. He was a man who commanded legions with a glance, yet he was being defied by a dog and a sleeping infant. He needed them out. The note in the blanket had confirmed his worst fears. This wasn't just a stray child, this was a target. Malachi, the collector, was a man who stripped people of their dignity before he stripped them of their lives. Silas knew that if Malachi was hunting Lyra, the Iron Bastion was no longer a sanctuary, it was a bullseye. He moved to his wall of monitors, his fingers flying across the keys to tap into the city's grey market surveillance grid. He needed a place to drop them, a safe house, an orphanage outside the syndicate's reach, a convent in the hills. But as the screens flickered to life, the reality of the situation turned his blood to ice. The digital map of the city was bleeding red. Malachi's scouts, easily identified by their tactical black SUVs and the aggressive, systematic way they patrolled the intersections, were everywhere. They weren't just searching, they were cordoning. 3 of them were already stationed at the mouth of the industrial park leading to Silas's estate. Another group was systematically checking every vehicle leaving the district. Malachi had turned the city into a net, and the holes were closing fast. Silas looked back at Lyra. She had fallen back into a deep, innocent sleep, unaware that her existence had just ignited a shadow war. Juno stood over her, the dog's white coat contrasting sharply with the dark shadows of the room. Silas realized with a grim clarity that there was no dropping her off. To move her now was to hand her over to a man who didn't believe in mercy. For the first time in 10 years, the enforcer felt the suffocating weight of a life that didn't belong to him. He had spent a decade building a vault to keep the world out, only to find that the most dangerous thing in the city was now tucked safely inside it. Silas sat in his high-backed leather chair, the glow of the surveillance monitors casting a ghostly blue light over his scarred face. He wasn't just an enforcer tonight. He was a target. And as Juno moved to lie down across the threshold of the room, her eyes never leaving him, Silas knew the silence of his life had officially come to an end. The Iron Bastion had been designed to withstand a military-grade siege, yet it was currently being dismantled by a high-pitched, rhythmic wailing that no amount of reinforced concrete could dampen. Lyra was awake, and she was making it known that her needs far exceeded the tactical capabilities of a silent enforcer. Silas stood over the stroller, his face tight with a tension that 3 decades in the underworld had never managed to produce. Beside him, Juno sat with a look of pointed judgment, her tail giving a single, impatient thump against the floor. "I don't have what she needs," Silas rasped, the words feeling like gravel in his throat. He was a man who kept a 6-month supply of ammunition and non-perishables, but his pantry held nothing for a 6-month-old human. Leaving was a risk, but staying was impossible. Silas activated his encrypted burner phone, placing an order at a 24-hour warehouse on the edge of the district. He didn't use a delivery service, he couldn't risk a stranger at his gates. 10 minutes later, dressed in a nondescript hoodie that hid his scar and his holster, Silas was moving through the rain-slicked streets in his armored sedan. He drove with one eye on the rearview mirror, tracking the black SUVs of Malachi's scouts as they prowled the main arteries of the city. He moved like a ghost through the shadows, utilizing the service alleys he usually reserved for extractions. When he returned to the bastion, he carried 3 heavy bags of supplies into the kitchen. He felt more out of place than he ever had during a deep cover operation. He laid the items out on the cold granite island: plastic bottles, canisters of powdered formula, and a brightly colored box of diapers that seemed to mock the grim aesthetic of the room. Silas picked up a small, glossy manual he had grabbed from the shelf, the New Parent's Guide to the First Year. He held it with the same intense focus he usually applied to a blueprint of a rival's compound. His brow furrowed as he read a section titled "Deciphering the Cry." "Hunger, discomfort, or a need for soothing," he muttered, glancing at Lyra, who was now turning a concerning shade of pink. He looked at the formula canister, his hands, which could disassemble a rifle in 18 seconds, fumbling with the delicate plastic seal. He measured the scoops with agonizing precision, his heart hammering against his ribs as he realized he was terrified of getting the ratio wrong. After several minutes of trial and error involving a thermometer and a pan of warm water, Silas finally offered the bottle. The transition from chaotic noise to the soft, rhythmic sound of feeding was instantaneous. The silence returned to the bastion, but it was different now, softer, laced with the scent of warm milk instead of gun oil. Silas sat on a low bench, leaning his back against the wall while Juno rested her massive head on his knee. He looked down at the manual again, his thumb hovering over a chapter on bonding. A faint, weary smile touched the corner of his mouth, softening the harsh line of his scar. The most feared man in the city was sitting in a darkened fortress, holding a plastic bottle for a child who didn't know his name, while the world outside waited to burn them both down. He was no longer just an enforcer, he was a provider. And for the first time in 10 years, he felt a flicker of something that wasn't cold or hollow. The quiet of the nursery was not broken by a cry, but by the sharp, jarring vibration of a burner phone on the granite countertop. Silas reached for it before the second pulse could echo. The screen displayed no number, only an encrypted string of characters that signaled a high-level breach of his privacy. Beside him, Juno's ears swiveled, her body tensing as she sensed the sudden shift in the room's electricity. "The vault has finally been cracked," a voice purred through the speaker. It was a voice like sandpaper on silk, refined, yet inherently abrasive. "I must say, Silas, I expected a tactical decoy, not a domestic one. You're slipping. Malachi. The collector." Silas didn't respond immediately. He looked at Lyra, who was gripping his index finger with surprising strength as she drifted back into a milk-drunk slumber. He stepped out of the room, Juno trailing him like a silent, snowy specter, and didn't speak until he was behind the reinforced glass of his study. "State your business, Malachi," Silas rasped, his voice a low warning. "My business is currently in your foyer, smelling of baby powder," Malachi replied with a light chuckle. "Let's skip the posturing. That child carries more than just the Reyes bloodline. Her mother was clever, Silas. Too clever. She hit the decryption keys for the ghost ledger, 400 million in untraceable digital assets, within the biological markers of that infant's medical profile. Lyra isn't just a girl, she's the most expensive hard drive in history." The air in the room seemed to thin. Silas looked at the monitors, watching the red dots of Malachi's scouts circling the industrial park. He had known Lyra was a target, but a fortune of that magnitude meant Malachi would never walk away. He would burn the city to the ground to get her. "I'm a reasonable man," Malachi continued, his tone shifting to one of predatory negotiation. "I know you value your solitude. Give me the child, and I will erase every debt, every file, and every shadow hanging over your name. You can walk out of that bastion a free man, Silas. No more hiding. No more vault. Just an empty horizon and enough money to buy it." Silas stared at his reflection in the dark monitor. 10 years ago, he would have taken that deal without a second thought. Freedom was the one thing he had never been able to buy. But then he felt the faint, lingering warmth on his hand where Lyra's fingers had just been. He looked at Juno, who was watching him with a gaze that seemed to judge the very weight of his soul. The child isn't a package, Silas said, his voice dropping to a register that promised violence. Careful, Silas, Malachi warned, the humor vanishing from his voice. Don't let a ghost white dog and a pretty face turn a professional into a martyr. You have until dawn to open the gates. If you don't, I'll stop collecting assets and start collecting heads. Starting with yours. The line went dead. Silas stood in the oppressive silence of the bastion, the weight of the digital fortune and the child's life resting squarely on his shoulders. He looked at the scar in the mirror, the mark of a man who had failed once. He wouldn't fail again. He turned toward his armory, the vault finally ready to show the world why it was built. The blue light of the surveillance monitors hummed in the background, but Silas's attention was fixed on the Great Pyrenees. Juno was behaving strangely. She wasn't resting by the crib or patrolling the perimeter as she had been for the last hour. Instead, she stood by the empty stroller in the corner of the study, her hackles raised in a stiff, white ridge along her spine. She let out a low, staccato chuff, not a bark of aggression, but a precise signal of discovery. Silas stood, his hand instinctively ghosting toward the knife at his belt. "What is it?" he murmured, his voice barely a breath. Juno didn't look at him. She lowered her massive head and began to nudge the heavy canvas lining of the stroller's underside with her snout. She was insistent, her movements surgical. When Silas didn't move fast enough, she grabbed the edge of the fabric in her teeth and pulled, exposing the inner structural frame. Silas knelt beside her, his fingers tracing the cold metal tubing. He saw nothing at first, until his gaze caught a microscopic deviation in the soldering of the axle housing. It was a professional job, the kind of work usually reserved for high-end state espionage. Tucked into a recessed groove was a device no larger than a grain of rice, blinking with a rhythmic, infrared pulse that was invisible to the naked eye. A live tracker. His heart hammered a slow, heavy beat against his ribs. Malachi hadn't just been guessing, he had been navigating by a North Star tucked right under the child's head. Silas looked at Juno. The dog was watching him now, her head tilted, her expression one of calm expectation. She hadn't just brought the baby to his gates, she was actively managing the security of the asset. "You knew," Silas whispered. The realization shifted something fundamental in his perspective. He had spent his life viewing the world through the lens of individual survival, believing that any variable he couldn't personally control was a liability. He had treated Juno as a burden, a chaotic element in his structured vault. But as she sat there, guarding the stroller while he carefully extracted the device with a pair of needle-nose pliers, he saw her for what she truly was, a partner. She possessed a primordial intelligence that bypassed the need for words. She understood the stakes of the hunt as well as any soldier he had ever served with, perhaps better. She was the silent sensor to his heavy artillery. Silas dropped the tracker into a lead-lined container, severing the signal and plunging Malachi into digital blindness. He looked at his hands, then at the dog. For the first time since the night of the storm, the weight of the coming war felt manageable. He wasn't alone in this fortress. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before finally burying his fingers in the thick, coarse fur of Juno's neck. She didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch, a silent pact sealed in the dim light of the iron bastion. Silas Vane, the man who trusted no one, had just found an ally in a white ghost. And together, they would turn his home into a graveyard for anyone foolish enough to come knocking. The blue light of the surveillance monitors hummed in the background, but inside the small room Silas had repurposed as a nursery, the air was warm and still. Lyra sat on the center of his massive, leather-bound desk, propped up by a barricade of tactical gear bags and cashmere sweaters. She was awake, her movements no longer frantic but curious, her wide eyes following the dust motes that danced in the glow of a single desk lamp. Silas sat motionless before her, his large frame hunched over as he watched her. He had spent his life evaluating threats, but this tiny creature was an anomaly he couldn't categorize. She didn't fear his size or the coldness of his gaze. While the rest of the world saw a vault, she saw a person. Beside the desk, Juno lay with her chin resting on Silas's boot, her breathing a rhythmic, calming anchor in the silence. Slowly, Lyra reached out. Her movements were jerky and uncoordinated, the hallmark of a life just beginning to understand its own reach. Silas didn't move as her small, soft hand rose toward his face. He felt a sharp, internal pull to recoil, to protect the perimeter of his person, but he stayed still. Her fingers, delicate as porcelain, landed squarely on the jagged ridge of his scar. The skin there was dead and desensitized, yet the contact felt like a live wire hitting water. She traced the rough texture of the failure he had worn for 10 years, her expression one of focused wonder rather than pity. In that moment, the iron bastion felt less like a fortress and more like a tomb. Silas realized that for a decade, he had been breathing but not living, existing in a vacuum where the only sound was the echo of his own isolation. He looked at Lyra's face, so vibrant and full of potential, and a terrifying thought took root in his mind. If he stayed the silent enforcer, if he kept her within these reinforced concrete walls, this was all she would ever know. She would grow up in a world of shadows, learning that safety only existed behind iron bars and that love was a liability to be buried. He saw her future unfolding as a series of encrypted files and tactical retreats, and for the first time in his life, Silas felt a profound sense of revulsion. He didn't want her to be a package or a key. He didn't want her to understand the weight of a burner phone or the necessity of a panic room. He wanted her to know the sound of laughter that wasn't muffled by soundproofing, and the sight of a horizon that wasn't viewed through a sniper's scope. The ice that had encased his heart since the night of the ambush didn't just crack, it began to melt, a slow and painful thaw that brought with it the return of feeling. He reached up, his hand dwarfing hers, and gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Not here," he whispered, his voice cracking from years of disuse. "You won't grow up in the dark." Juno let out a soft, approving huff, and as Silas looked at the child who had bridged the gap of his silence, he knew that the vault was gone. He was no longer protecting a fortune, he was protecting a life. And to do that, he would have to do the one thing he feared most, he would have to let the world back in, even if he had to burn Malachi's empire to the ground to make it safe for her. The red strobe of the emergency lights painted the concrete corridors of the iron bastion in the color of warning. Malachi hadn't waited for dawn. At 2 a.m., the perimeter sensors didn't just chime, they screamed as a series of coordinated thermal charges shattered the north and south entry points. The collector had come to settle the debt, and he had brought a small army to do it. Silas stood in the center of the command hub, his face a mask of lethal focus. He didn't look like a father or a provider now, he looked like the enforcer the underworld feared. He checked the nursery feed one last time. Juno was already in position, her massive white body draped across the threshold of the safe room where Lyra lay. The dog's ears were pinned back, her eyes fixed on the only door, her primordial instinct overriding the calm of the previous days. "Hold the line, Juno," Silas whispered to the screen. Then, the power cut. The bastion plunged into a tactical blackout, illuminated only by the faint, green glow of Silas's night vision goggles. He stepped into the hallway, moving like a shadow through the architecture he knew better than his own name. The first team of intruders met him at the junction of the main gallery. They were professionals, moving in a tight diamond formation with silenced carbines, but they weren't prepared for a man who had turned his home into a predatory maze. Silas didn't use a gun initially. He used the environment. He triggered the pressure plate steam vents, blinding the lead scout, before stepping out of the darkness. His movements were a blur of calculated violence, disarm, strike, neutralize. He moved through the halls with a terrifying fluidity, clearing the path toward the heart of the estate. Every time a mercenary managed to bypass his traps, Silas was there, a silent ghost with a scarred face that promised no quarter. But the real battle was happening at the nursery door. Three of Malachi's elite breached the upper floor, their boots thudding heavily against the floorboards. As they reached the safe room, they didn't find a locked door, they found a nightmare in white fur. Juno didn't wait for them to aim. She launched herself with a guttural roar that shook the very walls. She was 130 pounds of muscle and protective fury, a blur of white in the darkness. She took the first man down before he could level his weapon, her jaws locking onto his tactical vest and dragging him into the shadows. By the time Silas reached the upper landing, the hallway was a wreckage of discarded gear and retreating men. He saw Juno standing over the fallen, her coat stained but her stance unbroken. She looked at him, her chest heaving, and for a fraction of a second, the two guardians locked eyes. There was no need for words. Silas took point, his rifle raised, and Juno moved to his flank, the two of them working in a seamless, lethal synchronicity that no training could replicate. Malachi's army had expected to crack a vault. Instead, they had walked into a furnace. As Silas fired the final shots that sent the remaining scouts scrambling back into the night, the silence returned to the bastion, but it wasn't the silence of a tomb. It was the hard-won quiet of a sanctuary that had held its ground. Silas lowered his weapon, his breath hitching as he heard a faint, tiny whimper from the crib. They had survived the siege, but the war had changed them both. The vault hadn't just held, it had fought back. The storm had passed, leaving the air outside the iron bastion smelling of ozone and wet earth. In the center of the driveway, illuminated by the dying embers of a scuttled tactical vehicle, Silas Vane stood over Malachi. The collector was no longer a shadow broker of high-end assets, he was a broken man, pinned to the cold pavement by the weight of Silas's boot and the cold barrel of a weapon pressed against his temple. "Do it," Malachi spat, blood staining his teeth. "Finish the cycle, Silas. Show the world you're still the man who never breaks. Kill me, and prove that the vault only opens for corpses." Silas looked down at him, his finger tightening on the trigger. For a decade, this had been his only language, the finality of a bullet, the absolute silence of the grave. It would be so easy to erase the threat, to settle the debt in the currency he knew best. But then, a soft, heavy weight leaned against his leg. Juno stood beside him, her white coat singed and matted, but her eyes were fixed on the sunrise beginning to bleed over the horizon. From the open doorway of the estate, he heard the faint, sleepy babble of Lyra waking up. If he pulled the trigger, he would be protecting her, but he would also be sentencing her to live in the shadow of the man he used to be. He would be keeping the cycle of blood spinning for another generation. Silas slowly eased the hammer back. He lowered the weapon. "No," Silas rasped, the word carrying more weight than any threat. "The vault is closed, Malachi. I'm done being your ghost." Instead of the killing blow, Silas reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a modified transmitter. He keyed a frequency he hadn't used in years, a direct line to a federal task force that had been hunting the collector for a decade. He tossed the device onto Malachi's chest. "The encrypted ledger is already in their hands. You aren't worth the lead." He turned his back on his enemy, walking toward the iron bastion without looking back. Behind him, the distant wail of sirens began to fill the morning air, but for the first time, Silas didn't feel the need to disappear. 3 years later, the industrial fog had been replaced by the golden warmth of a California afternoon. In a public park far from the concrete walls of his old life, a man in a simple linen shirt sat on a bench, watching the world go by. His face still bore the jagged scar of a different life, but the hardness in his gray eyes had been replaced by a quiet, watchful peace. A toddler with golden curls and a laugh that sounded like bells chased a ball across the grass, her small legs moving with fearless joy. Beside her, a massive Great Pyrenees moved with a graceful, primordial dignity, her white coat gleaming in the sun. Juno never strayed more than a few feet from Lyra, acting as a living shield and a constant companion. Lyra tripped, tumbling into the soft clover, and let out a surprised giggle. She looked back at the bench, holding up a handful of yellow wildflowers. "Look, Silas." Silas Vane smiled, a real, unchecked expression that reached his eyes. He stood up and walked toward them, leaving the shadows behind forever. The vault was finally, truly open, and for the first time, he realized that love wasn't a weakness that led to failure, it was the only thing strong enough to win the war. The saga of Silas Vane, the man the underworld whispered of as the Vault, reached its conclusion not with the hollow ring of a closing safe, but with the vibrant laughter of a child in the sun. For years, Silas had built his life on a foundation of cold concrete and absolute silence, believing that to feel was to fail. But when a ghost-white Great Pyrenees pushed a fragile bundle of life through his iron gates, the fortress he had spent a decade perfecting began to crumble. Silas traded his arsenal for a father's devotion, proving that even the most hardened enforcer can find a mission worth more than survival. Through the unyielding loyalty of Juno and the innocent reach of Lyra, he discovered that true power isn't found in what you can destroy, but in what you are willing to protect. This story leaves us with a powerful truth: redemption is not a destination we reach, but a choice we make every single day. Silas Vane's transformation reminds us that love is the ultimate courage. It requires more strength to open a heart than it does to pull a trigger. It teaches us that miracles don't always announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes, they arrive on the quiet pause of a faithful companion in the middle of a storm, offering a second chance to those who thought they were beyond saving. No matter how deep the shadows of your past, it is never too late to turn toward the light. If the redemption of Silas and the unwavering spirit of Juno touched your heart today, we invite you to become a part of our story. If you believe that no soul is truly unreachable and that every child deserves a fortress of love, show your support. Share this narrative with someone who feels trapped in their own silence, and leave a comment below with the word redemption to let us know you're standing with us. Subscribe to Devout Mafia Tales right now to ensure you never miss a chapter of our cinematic journeys into faith, loyalty, and the extraordinary power of the human heart. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. Thank you.